I'd say we can start now. So I'm going to pass it on to Nela for the general introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Paulina, and welcome everybody to today's SDG Academy, another episode. We are very much looking forward to the discussion with our experts, Ina and Mirja. And I want to welcome you to this lecture series, which is organized by the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. That's an interfaculty research network here at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, where we connect researchers across disciplines, across faculties, to collaborate and to also work together with external partners. And this lecture series, this SDG Academy, we discuss various topics related to the SDGs. Today, it's the Biodiversity COP16 that just finished in Colombia. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And once more, welcome you all, and enjoy and have fun.
Thank you so much, Nela. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers so we're all familiar with each other. We're very lucky to have two great experts that will walk us through the events of COP16 and help us understand what actually happened there and what kind of expectations we can have post COP16 and whether the expectations we had prior to it actually lived up to those. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the two speakers. We have Ina Lehmann, who is the Assistant Professor of Governance of Global Biodiversity at the Institute for Environmental Studies at VU Amsterdam. And her research interests include the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity from local to global governance levels. This is something that she will also bring into the session today, so I'm very much looking forward. And our second speaker is Mirja Schoderer, and she's an assistant professor and also here at the Institute for Environmental Studies at VU Amsterdam. And her research focuses on contestations of natural resources use and control, with a topical emphasis on water, mineral and metal extraction, and the protection of biodiversity. So we have two great speakers, and we're going to have two perspectives. So I would say I'm going to pass it on. We're going to start with Mirja, who will be giving the first presentation. So Mirja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paulina, and Nele for having me, and Ina, of course, for sharing the stage. I'm gonna present some research that we did on Colombia, which incidentally was also this year's host country. So the reason why we're doing it in this in this order is basically because we wanted to give you a first impression on what perhaps some of the stakes of the discussions are that took place at COP this year. So to give you a bit of a hands-on impression of what it actually means to do biodiversity protection on the ground. So I will be talking about one particular case study and some of the implications of that. And then we're going to swing it to Ina to talk a little bit more about what actually happened at this year's COP in Cali. So basically, I will be talking about protected areas and their environmental justice implications in one particular. So in terms of protected areas, what is good to know, I think, as we're talking about protected area biodiversity governance, is to know that protected areas as a policy instrument were basically part of biodiversity or global biodiversity governance from the get-go. So if we think about policy instruments in general, protected areas have a very, very long history. Just, thinking about national parks in the US, in Europe. And when the Convention on Biological Diversity was established in 1992, they already mentioned protected areas as one of the key instruments to establish. And that also figured in the first set of global targets, the Aichi targets that were adopted in 2010, among other measures of biodiversity protection, such as, for example, reducing pressures on biodiversity and so on and so forth. And 2 years ago, at the last COP, the so-called Kunming-Montreal framework was adopted. And one of the key goals there is the so-called 30 by 30 goal, which basically claims that by 2030, the idea is that 30% of all land, water, and sea is meant to be protected for or through protected areas or so-called other effective means of area-based conservation. And from the beginning, what is quite interesting here is that this idea of establishing protected areas was linked to the demand for equitable and effective governance. So from the beginning on, there was an understanding that as we're doing protected areas, there might be implications for who is affected by that, and a need to govern these in some way so that the biodiversity protection effects that are hoped for can actually be seen on the ground. And one of the key issues that were supposed to be discussed this year at the COP, and that were discussed at the COP, was a funding mechanism at the global level to basically fund the implementation of these protected areas, to fund equitable and effective governance mechanisms, and to further think about or to promote other effective means of area-based conservation, which are a bit more challenging in terms of what they actually apply. And what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is basically to explore what the connections are between protected areas and sort of equitable and effective governance questions at one particular example. And this example, and now I need to watch out that I don't accidentally mute myself again, is one where we look at a protected area in Santander. And this area is called the Parque Natural Regional, PNR, Bosques de Misigüey. It was implemented in 2014 by the Regional Environmental Authority, who basically received the task from the Colombian government to establish or to increase the area under state protection. So at the national level, Colombia set targets for extending its areas under state protection. And these targets then got delegated to the regional environmental authorities, who then had the task to basically designate and select particular areas that they wanted to call, that they wanted to turn into protected areas. The park that we looked at has a total area of 2,800 hectares, more or less, and the vast majority of these are properties that belong or extends over properties that belong to smallholder farmers. And this area was chosen because the forest cover was very, very good, and because it's an area of particular hydrological importance. And what's important here is that despite legal provisions, there was no real consultation that took place, and there was also no proper information of the people living in this area that the park was established and what that meant for them. So, for example, what the Regional Environmental Authority ended up doing was they sent letters, invitation letters to meetings in village centers, but they worked with an outdated list of proprietors, and they took no steps to actualize this list. So they never actually went to the villages beforehand to figure out if there were processes of succession, if there were new people in the area. So many people who live there, who have property there, didn't receive the invitation in the first place. Some very old people couldn't read the invitations, even though they received them. And for others, the distance to the village center is simply prohibitive because it's up to a 3 or 4 hour hike to get to the village center from some of the smallholder farmers. And because the invitations were very unspecific, some people who received them also just didn't know what was even going to be discussed. The few people who actually went ended up reporting that it was more of a general, what is biodiversity protection good and important for, and less of a meeting of what does it actually mean to have this park. So by the time we got there in the beginning of the year, farmers usually knew that somewhere around there is a protected area, but they didn't know where exactly it stops and where it ends, and also what the precise land use restrictions are. So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of worry among farmers in the area, precisely because they didn't know what the actual status of this park was. They received no compensation, even though there were land use restrictions in place. So some people had cultivations, coffee plantations, and so on and so forth, in areas that officially fall under the or within the park boundaries, and no co-management or anything sort of. There also was no recognition of the fact, so the environmental authority never sort of publicly recognized that this park extends over private property, which in particular in this area is quite a large issue, as there was quite significant armed conflict and some people got expropriated by armed groups. So this lack of protection for someone's private property is actually quite a sensitive topic in the area. So when we look at the case from a sort of environmental justice lens, what we can see here is that in distributive terms, this park caused quite significant injustice in the sense that farmers in the area received costs, land use restrictions that were not compensated in any sort of shape or form, whereas the benefits of the park also pertained to the regional environmental authority that basically got to report that it met its targets, to downstream users of the water resources, and so on and so forth. So we basically see a mismatch in who bears the cost and who receives the benefits. There was some procedural injustice in the sense that the farmers weren't involved in the decision-making and didn't receive proper information, and also a missed recognition, as I said, of their property rights, but also, and what is, I think, even more striking, is a misrecognition of the extent to which the farmers themselves had effectively conserved the area in which they were living, because the park actually got declared because it had such a good forest cover, because it was in such a good state. So essentially, what the authority ended up doing was to look at the farmers as destroyers of nature, rather than, as I said, effective conservators, basically in their own right. And also, when we look at how these effects of conservation are now reported at the global scale, so when we're looking at, for example, monitoring the progress towards targets, what happens in this particular park and the forest cover that is maintained is reported as an effect of public conservation. So this counts as something that the Colombian state basically has achieved, when in reality, it's really the effort of the farmers that has led to this good conservation status. What ended up happening after we arrived in the case study area is that because of this park, there was quite significant mobilization among the farmers, and they were able to broker a meeting with the environmental authority in charge that during this meeting recognized that there were shortcomings in how they had done the process. And they ended up floating plans for compensation payments, so to ameliorate some of the distributive injustices, and to potentially implement a co-management pilot with farmers, also alleviating some of the procedural injustices. The big issue with that, and this is where we link to the global sphere again and to this year's COP, is that there was a significant, and there is a significant shortage of funds. So the Regional Environmental Authority has applied to the national government for funding these plans, but it's not clear if they're going to receive them. And this would be basically precisely the sort of process or the sort of thing that would potentially get funded, or that could get support from, let's say, a global fund for biodiversity protection. So the lack of a funding mechanism in place is actually something that has very strong implications, or that could have potentially strong implications for this particular case as well. And with that, I think this is the segue over to Ina, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the global funding mechanism and what got and didn't get decided at this year's COP.
Thank you so much.
Stop screen sharing.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Mirja. It was great to listen to you and recognize a bit of those tensions as well. So I think we can have a very interesting conversation afterwards, and I'm sure there's going to be some questions from the audience as well. But thank you for setting the stage quite in a quite specialized way already. And now we're going to go on to the second presentation from Ina, and she will be sharing one success and one failure, as she phrased it to me earlier. So I'm looking forward which specific successes and failures we'll be talking about today. The floor is yours, Ina.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you, Paulina and Nele, for organizing this, and also to Mirja, of course, for providing such a nice ground for now looking into what's happening at the global level with regard to protected areas, but also beyond, because biodiversity, of course, is more than protected areas. And so, as all of you know, the COP has been taking place, just finished this very weekend, and in Cali, in Colombia. And indeed, I will talk about some successes and some failure, specifically in implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is adopted at the last COP. And indeed, I want to before talking about this COP that just took place, I want to take you back to the previous COP in Montreal 2 years ago, because this COP really laid the foundations for for this COP this year. And you really need to have a little bit of a background on last year, the COP 2 years ago, to hopefully follow what I will be telling you about. Because indeed, Mirja already mentioned it, 2 years ago, the COP in Montreal adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was a 10-year strategic action plan, so an action plan until the end of this decade. And it's very much a practice of the CBD to work with these 10-year strategic action plans, because the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity as such, is indeed a very broad convention that has only very vague provisions for what its state parties should do. And so we have these 10-year strategic action frameworks to add a bit of life and detail to what should be done. And one of them, so the latest one, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, adopted 2 years ago, was indeed celebrated as a big success. So you see the picture here with the people on the podium celebrating the adoption. You see the COP decision, and of course now the logo, the Biodiversity Plan for Life on Earth. That's what we have to guide us for the next years. The GBF indeed has 4 overarching goals for 2050 for a vision of living in harmony with nature. So that's like the long-term perspective that we now have. But it also has 23 action-oriented targets, which should be achieved by 2030. And this little ball that you see in the picture with the different colors, so that those are 23, actually, they represent the 23 targets for 2030. One of them is the so-called 30 by 30 target mentioned by Mirja. So the idea that by 2030, we should have 30% of land and water globally in protected area or similar status. But there's also many other targets related, for instance, to invasive alien species, the reduction of pollution, the sustainable use of agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, forestry, and so on. So quite a list of things to do. And that's essentially, even though it was a big success to agree on these 23 targets for 2030, was where COP15 2 years ago left, more or less. So they agreed on the targets, but the implementation was still largely left open. And that's where this year's COP comes in. So COP16 really was a COP that should take us, or the world society, from agreement to action. And now, as Mirja and Paulina already said, I will address one major achievement in terms of getting us from agreement to action, and one key failure with getting us from agreement to action at this year's COPs. And both have to do in one way or the other, I think, with the challenges on the local level just outlined by Mirja. And I will start with the achievements, which have to do with the incorporation of indigenous peoples in the working of the convention. But again, I will go back a little bit to give you some background for you to understand why integrating indigenous peoples in the working of the convention is so important. And indeed, Mirja has already mentioned, the convention has been adopted in 1992. And since then, indigenous rights really have been on its agenda. So Mirja's story about how, in her case, local communities, but in many cases also indigenous peoples in particular, are being excluded from their areas, are not allowed to use resources, are not being asked in decision-making processes. So this is actually quite representative for what happens around the world, and specifically happens to indigenous peoples. And it has to do with a lack of protection of indigenous peoples, but often also local communities' rights in many countries. And this is specifically important as we're talking about the extension, for example, of protected areas to 30% of global land, because this will mean that many areas that are now being used by indigenous peoples maybe cannot be used in the same ways as they were used before. So it's really, indigenous rights have always been a huge issue for the CBD. And I think this has also always been recognized because indigenous peoples are often considered to be the stewards of biodiversity. Biodiversity often is in a very good stage in lands of indigenous peoples. And so it has always been clear in the COP negotiations of the CBD that indigenous peoples somehow need to be brought on board, that their rights need to be respected. But of course, there has also always been opposition. So the Convention on Biological Diversity has 196 member states. Not all of them are treating their indigenous peoples, let's say, in very just ways domestically. So it's always been a challenge of getting indigenous peoples' rights into the decisions of the convention. But what you see when you look at it over the years is that there has indeed been slow but steady progress in integrating indigenous peoples' rights, at least on paper. That's what we should say. This is also something that we saw at COP15 in Montreal, where really there were some new milestones for indigenous rights protections also included in some of the new 23 targets that we have seen adopted. And it was also, that's why I have this picture here, so indigenous peoples themselves who fought for this at the COPs. So we have here the example of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which, so to speak, is the key go-to point for indigenous mobilization at COPs. And they have been fighting hard for getting indigenous peoples into different COP decisions. But then, of course, the point still is that these decisions have to be implemented domestically. And if a state does not want to protect its indigenous peoples, there's not much that the CBD can do about it because it doesn't have a strong review and monitoring or even sanctioning mechanism. So indigenous peoples have still been continuing and trying to see new ways or seek new ways to make their voices heard, also in the decision-making bodies, in the structures of the CBD. And this is where one of the main achievements of this COP comes in, because you may have heard this in the news. So there was a new subsidiary body for indigenous peoples established. And what does it mean? Well, a subsidiary body, in a sense, is a very technical thing. So it's a technical body that advises the COP. It does not have any decision-making authority in that sense. The decision-making authority is only at the COPs, where the member states and only the member states can take a decision. But still, this subsidiary body has the mandate to provide advice to the CBD. So this is really something very new, and it was really celebrated also as the success of decades of work led by indigenous peoples and local communities. And you here have the picture actually from the COP, how people burst out in cheers when the decision was adopted in the last night or the last day of the COP, that there would be this new body. And it really is there to formalize participation and also redress imbalances experienced at the national level, because in many states at the national level, indigenous peoples may not have much of a voice, and they cannot really influence the will formation at the domestic level. And so maybe their governments still go to the COP without having taken the indigenous concerns and indigenous wishes into account and into their negotiation position. But with the indigenous peoples now having the subsidiary body, they can organize themselves and to provide advice to the COP. So that's quite a big achievement on this long path of getting more recognition for indigenous rights. I wish I could stop here, but I will also talk about one of the major drawbacks, and that has to do with finance, because as Mirja said, of course, biodiversity conservation is costly, and many poorer countries cannot really stem the efforts themselves. So they don't have the domestic budget to do whatever is needed for, especially now with the 2030 with the 30 by 30 goal, really expanding protected areas. That creates a lot of costs in terms of management, in terms of administration, but also there's all the other targets about reforming the agricultural sector and about managing invasive alien species and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that this comes with a lot of costs. And many poor countries have always said, and have also said at COP15 in 2022, that they cannot stem these costs. And so again, going back to a bit of a background on COP15 first, there was a decision about, well, one of the targets that was adopted relates to biodiversity finance. Namely, there was this decision to generate $200 billion per year in biodiversity finance by 2030. And that's really money from all sources. So that's public money, but that's also money generated from the private sector, for instance. And already at that time, that was criticized a lot because actually the global funding deficit that we have is $700 billion per year. So that's already like the scale we are talking about. But at least there was this decision, and there was a promise by rich countries to contribute $20 billion per year at least in public finance by 2025. But we are far from this, as I will explain later. The second point that was highly contested, and that's also what Mirja was talking about, is there a fund? Is there a global mechanism for also distributing that money? And yes, there is. There was the Global Environment Facility even before, which is a dedicated finance mechanism for all kinds of international environmental agreements, but also for biodiversity. But it has always been criticized for being under the World Bank. And many developing countries or low-income countries have criticized that for them, the money is really hard to access, especially the lowest income countries always had problems accessing the money from the Global Environment Facility. The money always went more into like mid-income countries. And they were also always critical of the fact that the Global Environment Facility is dominated in terms of the decision-making structures by the high-income countries. So already at COP15, this was a major issue, and there was this decision to establish a Global Biodiversity Framework fund, which should be filled with the money that was pledged. But still, this fund was under the GEF and thereby still under the World Bank. So there was still a drive at this COP to reform the entire system. And the entire system really means both. So the money that should be available, but also the structures through which it should be distributed. So as we see here on this slide, there was the promise of $20 billion per year in public finance by 2025. In 2022, that's the latest data that was available. This was only about half of it. But by 2024, no substantial further commitments have been recorded. So we can assume that this is still more or less the case. So really, the low-income countries were really upset at the COP and were asking for more money. And there was indeed a draft decision on mobilizing more resources, but that didn't come to being voted on, as I will explain in a second. The second point still was this issue about how should the money distributed? Should it be in a fund under the Global Environment Facility and thereby indirectly under the World Bank, or should it be a really separate instrument? And there was really this discussion about it, the low-income countries wanting this very much, the high-income countries really being against it because they say, we have so many structures, the whole system is so fragmented, it really won't help us to create yet another financing structure. So this was where the negotiations got stuck in the last days, hours, the last night. They negotiated the last night through about these questions. The COP should have ended last Friday evening. Last Saturday morning at 8 a.m., they were still negotiating about these finance issues. And then the problem was that many delegates had to leave because they couldn't change their flights. They had their flight booked, especially, again, low-income countries said, well, we don't have the money to just rebook our flights, to just extend our stay. stays here, the delegations got smaller and smaller. And at some point, somebody raised the question whether the COP is actually still able to take decisions. And it was not, because not enough states were present. So no decision at this COP about increasing finance, and no decision at this COP about reforming the whole financial system. So in that sense, this really, and yeah, you see the people here, it's a picture actually from this COP of delegates just sleeping at the desks at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning after negotiating all night about these questions. And so in that sense, unfortunately, at least from a finance perspective, the COP really ended unfinished, I would say. And there were a few more things that are now unfinished and on the agenda. So resource mobilization and financial mechanisms, I've talked about this, two very contested, but also really very important points for getting the whole system going. You remember I talked in the beginning about getting from agreement to action. It would be very hard to get to action without these decisions about finance. And until 2030, we have 6 years left. So think about what this might mean for achieving all of the 23 targets. But also another thing that I didn't talk about, but that was high on the agenda for this COP, was the planning, monitoring, reporting, and review mechanism, because we have all of these great targets adopted at COP15 2 years ago, but what COP15 didn't finish was to think about a mechanism for reporting about these targets and for reviewing them, reviewing the achievement. And that actually also was on the agenda, and actually one of the main points on the agenda for this COP 2016, to finish the indicators and monitoring framework, which they had kind of half finished at the last COP. Now, this decision, again, also couldn't be taken because everything got stuck on the finance discussions, and then the COP had to suspend. They didn't formally end it. They suspended it at 8:30 on Saturday morning because, well, not enough states were there to vote. And also the budget of the convention itself was not voted on, which is a very serious issue because the workings of the Secretariat depend on this. So if there's no budget for the convention, the Secretariat actually cannot work and cannot be a supporting mechanism. So what will happen now is sometime in the next month, I guess this is being very heatedly discussed now, there will be a new interim meeting, kind of a continuation of the COP, to at least finish the budget and vote on the budget so that the Secretariat can continue to work. And then the next COP in 2026 will be in Yerevan, Armenia. And we will hope that by then some of the finance discussions have been resolved, either in the interim meeting or at least so far that in 2026 there can be quick decisions. I'm sorry to end on this kind of depressing note, but I think this is where we stand. I have already also talked about some success in the beginning, and I'm happy to answer your questions about maybe not what's coming next because nobody knows, but about how we got there and what the other challenges are.
Thank you so much, Ina. I think well said. Of course, no one wants to end up in a bit of this, let's say, negative space, but I also think you've provided us with a very realistic take of what was happening at COP16. And, you know, there's no point in dwelling on the fact that this is not the best outcome. That's sadly what it is, and we just need to somehow move forward. So there is definitely a lot of uncertainty. This is something that I also wasn't aware of. So thank you as well. Likely or similarly, thank you, Mirja. Both of you really gave us a really good insight into COP16 and the Biodiversity Convention in general and the different mechanisms there. So I really, really appreciate that. I'm sure the audience appreciates that too. Before we jump into the questions, and this is also a reminder for the audience to not be shy and post your questions to the speakers. Before we go into that, because we already have the first question from one of the audience members, I wanted to ask both of you to look back at the past 2 weeks and just share also a little bit on your, let's say, personal journey. So following these developments, how did you feel? You know, I could imagine that perhaps the first day there was high expectations, maybe excitement. How was it for you following what was actually happening and revolving in front of your eyes? Ina, would you like to open up the discussion here?
Absolutely, I can. And I think you and I have briefly discussed this before when you asked me whether I could provide you with a statement for this event. And I said, well, sorry, I really can't because we have to wait until it's over. And I think as an observer of the COP, that's kind of always your mindset, that you think it's not over until it's over, because we see this actually quite often with these multilateral events, that a lot can happen in the last days, but a lot can also not happen in the last days. And it was similar actually 2 years ago at COP15, where halfway into the COP, people were very depressed and had the feeling, like after the first of the 2 weeks, had the feeling that this is not moving forward. We are going backward. We will not come up with a new framework. And in the end, they did. And with a framework, it has some difficulties, of course, but with a framework that has also achieved a lot of applause from many sides, including indigenous peoples who said, like, our rights have been strengthened in the new framework. So again, I think for this COP, it was also for me the question of what happens at the very end. The very last days are always so important, and often the most important decisions are also kept until the very last days, because you always try to first work on the smaller issues, and of course then it's only the ministerial people being there, but then towards the end also really the ministers come, sometimes the head of states, and they have to work on the big issues. So there's always hope that in the end the last days will still turn things around. I don't know what would have happened this COP if time hadn't run out. I think the fact that in the end they weren't even able to take decisions definitely played a big role.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for this take. How was it for you, Mirja?
I mean, not particularly different, actually. So thank you for sort of framing that, because I think what I was keeping my eyes peeled for was indeed also the question of what was going to be decided in terms of monitoring and evaluation. Because when we're looking at the monitoring framework for the 2030, the 30 by 30 target, for example, what it didn't include, or what hasn't really been focused on so much is the question of human rights. So the extent to which area-based conservation actually accounts for people's property rights and so on and so forth. So precisely the kind of stuff we've seen in Colombia. And there were, for example, quite a lot of organizations, among them Amnesty International, that really pushed for that to be included in the monitoring framework. And when it became clear, basically, that there wouldn't be time left, I think that was quite a strong blow for quite a number of people. And there were, I can't even remember if that was during the COP or immediately after, where people basically were questioning this whole mode of leaving everything to the end. Because, of course, if all the important stuff happens at the end, that also means that if you get stalled at one point, then everything else that was still meant to come and still meant to be decided on kind of just falls off the wayside in a massive, landslide of things that can't get addressed. Unfortunately, was what ended up happening.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, I really appreciate that you're sharing also very personal experiences here, because especially being involved in the field and having worked also in Colombia, from my understanding, is that correct, Mirja? Did you work in Colombia as well? I can imagine it's also a very different experience observing this COP and really following the developments. So once again, thank you so much, both of you. I see there's a question that actually relates to your answer, Mirja. It's about the 30 by 30. So there's a comment and then related question. A comment from John Barimo that 30 by 30 is an admirable goal. However, having worked within marine protected areas for many years, it's clear that without a multi-stakeholder informed management plan, ideally co-produced as well, and effective enforcement, they are generally little more than paper parks. So similar to your comment about human rights and also property rights, so taking a much wider perspective. The question is specifically whether there were any outcomes at COP16 to address this specific issue? How do we make it a reality? How do we move beyond?
To my understanding, this would have been precisely what falls under the whole monitoring and evaluation framework. And I think there's been the beginning of something like this, but I don't think it got further extended or decisively, voted into being at the COP. I'm certain, like, there were discussions, there's always discussions, but I don't think anything definitive was decided. Ina, is that your take as well?
Yeah, I haven't yet looked into all the decisions that were eventually adopted. And of course, there were a number of decisions adopted. So I couldn't add anything specific on this at this stage.
Thank you so much. There's another question slightly related, now talking about, taking a wider perspective also on the actors involved in initiatives such as 30 by 30. So looking at the indigenous people. So of course we have the supervisory body for indigenous peoples now, which is a huge achievement. But another participant is asking, what does that mean for other marginalized groups? And that's linking back to perhaps, I mentioned also, Mirja, from your presentation, but also Ina's presentation, finding this way of bridging the different voices and collaborating together. So with this new body established, what does it mean for groups that just happen to be the smaller actors within a given field? So smallholder farmers, specifically campesinos in the Latin American context, how could they be represented?
Ina, maybe you can say something about what this means, what the SB for Indigenous Peoples means in relation to that, and then I can speak a little bit about the OECMs.
Yeah, and I must say that, so the subsidiary body is called Subsidiary for Article 8J, which is a specific article of the convention that addresses, or around which all of the indigenous peoples' questions have revolved. I must say I'm not sure at this point whether they specifically also include smallholder farmers or campesinos, but in the whole CBD discussion, there's always this kind of phrase about indigenous peoples and local communities, which are of course not the same. And not all local communities are indigenous peoples or vice versa, but they are very often treated as one in the CBD context, which has also led to some discussion, of course, about, do we need separate body, or do we need to treat them separately or not? I think this is really an interesting question, but I cannot really oversee the implications at this stage. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been my main take basically as well, that there's been a tendency to basically lump these groups together in a way, for better or for worse, because in some ways interests do tend to align and in others not so much. And what is, I think, or what many people who are doing advocacy and who have worked with local communities have really sort of kept their eyes open for is this measure of other effective means of area-based conservation, because that can include basically all kinds of conservation efforts that you can somehow localize within a given territory that don't necessarily have to be state protected areas. So under this, you could also have something like community managed areas, or even sort of private nature reserves and so on and so forth. So for local communities that do protection efforts in parts of their territory, this has been quite a, I don't want to call it a guiding star, but this is basically something where people have really sort of listened up when that became part of the conversation. But the problem there is that in order to basically designate something or to define what exactly counts as this OECM, so other, when do you basically, what do you have to do to prove that this is an effective way of area-based conservation? So there are still a lot of conversations that need to happen, and also a lot of basically guidance needed on when you can call this an effective conservation measure, which again also requires resources to actually prove and to define and so on and so forth. So this, I would say, is one of the things to watch out for, but that doesn't necessarily relate to the subsidiary body or to sort of formalized representation.
Thanks so much. I see we can jump to a slightly different topic. There's a question about this COP being open to the general public. So one of the audience members said that from what they heard, this was the first one that was officially open. And the question is whether you've experienced these different levels of participation. However, you weren't there in person, so I think that would be quite difficult to answer. But the other part of the question is in what ways could increased public involvement in COPs impact policy outcomes? And it is a little bit of this, let's say, hypothetical question, but I'm curious if you have a take on that, whether maybe there's a bit of, the civil society lobby, a little bit of pressure from citizens. Would that be an option? What do you think? Maybe Mirja, I have you on my screen, so I'm going to start with you.
I was going to swing this to Ina as someone who's maybe at least been to one COP at some point in the past and can report on whether there was participation, at least, maybe not in the venue, but outside, and potential effects that has had. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. In a way, I do think that with side events, for example, you always have interest groups and also civil society organizations doing some sort of representation and doing advocacy for particular issues as well. So I think that is quite a good thing also, just in terms of placing issues on the agenda. I don't know if that's what you were referring to in terms of public involvement, the official side events, or if there was actually, if the venue was open to the public, which I don't think it was. But yeah, not having been there, I don't think I can really say much on that.
Ina, do you have something to add about the potential power of public involvement in meetings like COP?
Yeah, maybe also starting with not being 100% sure about the question, because indeed the general public as such did not have access to this COP, and it never had access. The general public never had access to previous COPs, because indeed you need, even as a civil society organization, you need to register for the COP. And of course, I mean, it's a UN event. There's definitely security measures, and there need to be security measures. So they cannot just open it up and everybody joins, especially imagine during a high-level segment when there's ministers from all over the world. You cannot just open it up to the general public, I guess. And also, of course, in terms of, space capacity. So this was one of the biggest COPs I heard, with like 23,000 registered participants. So you have to also manage this. So in that sense, the COP as such was not open to the general public, and neither have previous COPs been open to the general public. But as Mirja said, there's always a lot of civil society participation in the COP, because as civil society organizations can register as observers, which means they have to register with the CBD Secretariat. They have to prove that their organization is working in the field of biodiversity. And then they can get access to the negotiation ground. So they get a ground pass with which their members, also the members have to register individually, but then can access the sites, and as Mirja said, can organize side events, so events at which civil society can display their activities, or they can also do lobbying. I mean, of course, also I had in my presentation the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity. Their members also come there. They can organize side events, they can organize other meetings, but they also go there actually to lobby and to interact with the decision makers. So that's absolutely possible. But not only for civil society, also business are there to follow their interests and activities. And what has been the case in Cali, apparently, is that there has been a lot of things organized around the biodiversity theme and around the COP in the city. But that's what you have had at other COPs as well. And of course, also outside of the COP venue, there can be demonstrations. For example, we have already also seen that 2 years ago in Montreal, that there were huge demonstrations also against the involvement of or a presence of business actors at the COP, and so on and so forth. So that's always been going on, and that's always possible.
Thank you so much for the explanation and clarification from your side. Let's jump to the topic of funding, because this is definitely something that obviously has been mentioned in the media a lot. It has been mentioned also by Mirja when I asked her to look back at the COP itself, the results of it, so to say. This is something that obviously you mentioned, Ina, in your presentation. One of the participants is asking how many targets and to what extent are they jeopardized by the failure to define a funding mechanism. I think it would be quite hard to quantify it specifically, but perhaps we can go back to this conversation now. This is something that you touched upon, Ina, the fact that there wasn't a budget for the convention voted in. So what are some of the implications that you can think of, and are there any attempts to resolve this? Ina, would you like to start with an answer?
Yeah, I mean, there's different levels to this, I guess. So first of all, I said with regard to the budget of the convention itself, they already said like after the meeting was suspended, as they said, it was clear they need to continue because they need to have a budget for the convention. So that's I'm sure that's definitely going to happen, and that's not the big point of contestation. That was really more because they didn't get to vote. The other question is really about the finance, the international biodiversity finance. So how do we mobilize resources for biodiversity action, and how do we distribute international finance? And of course, as long as there is no other decision, we have the mechanism that we have, and that's the Global Biodiversity Fund that was agreed upon in 2022 at COP15, which is still under the Global Environment Facility. So that was a decision, and as long as there is no other decision, that decision is valid. And what will now happen with proposals to, or attempts from countries from the Global South to reform this system? I'm sure they will still try. How successful, I don't dare to say. And then the last level of this, the question about how many targets are affected. Well, of course, this is hard to quantify, but there's more targets than the protected areas. As I mentioned, there's also reform of agricultural sectors, of fisheries, of management of invasive species, trade in invasive species, all of that. And you can just say, if there is no money, or if there's too little money, countries will not be able to do a lot. And that, of course, is a problem, because we are in an extinction crisis.
Mirja, anything to add to this answer?
Yeah, I mean, for me also, it's a question if you're looking at global inequalities and how that then relates to biodiversity protection. Because what happened at the last COP is also that the biodiversity framework got adopted, even though there were several countries not on board with the decision. So countries like, I think it was Cameroon and the DRC, they didn't formally consent in the beginning to the text that got adopted, basically saying we have serious reservations. We don't think we can do this. And then the decision got voted through so there was quite a large follow-up. But these were also the countries basically saying we are, comparatively not as wealthy as the global north countries. We are countries that are rich in biodiversity, and here are targets with really large implications for how we do our natural resources management that quite strongly also got pushed for by global north countries who have less biodiversity, but, are more wealthy. So basically, if you want to see this happening, then there needs to be financial support. And now seeing that this really hasn't happened, I think is also quite a devastating lesson for these delegates. To basically see that something gets voted through at the global scale that then isn't followed up by commitments that would allow them to actually do what they sort of got pushed into committing themselves to. And again, I don't want to sort of drive the protected area stick home, because yes, as Ina keeps mentioning, biodiversity protection is a lot more than protected areas. But if you're a national government and you have targets to reach in terms of how much area you need to protect, you can always draw a GIS circle around an area and say, this is a protected area now. Here we are, target matched. But then what does that mean for the people whose land that is and who need to use that land?
Thank you so much. You're painting a very complete, but of course complex picture. That's sadly how it goes. I wanted to finish on a slightly more positive note. There's one question from a participant asking about some other initiatives that were started during COP16. For example, one mentioned was the Global Pact for Water and Biodiversity. I don't know if you heard about some of those kind of initiatives, maybe other ones. So we have the subsidiary body for Indigenous people that definitely is one of the successes, but perhaps there's something that also stayed with you as another success or something that can have a longer, let's say, ripple effect. Is there something that maybe comes to your mind? It requires a little bit of reflection, but I see Ina is unmuting herself.
No, I was just going to say, at least I haven't heard about this initiative. I don't know, that's mentioned in the chat. I don't know, Mirja, if you have heard about that particular initiative. Then maybe on a more global scale, what I can say is that there's always a lot of these initiatives revolving around these COPs. So these COPs, that's also what I said, there's 23,000 people there. There's a lot going on and a lot of networking and a lot of new initiatives being presented, sometimes from bottom up, from conservation NGOs, sometimes from states, sometimes from state coalitions, sometimes from the UN level. So a COP is always also like a breeding ground for new initiatives and new ideas. And so there could be actually quite a lot like of new initiatives like this one, even though I don't know that one in particular.
Thank you so much. I think indeed it's always a fertile ground for new initiatives, and I'm actually quite excited to look back at the different outcomes now, because I also haven't heard of that one. Thank you so much. We've arrived at the very end of the session. I wanted to extend my thanks to both of the speakers here. Thank you, Mirja. Thank you, Ina. Nele, thank you so much for the introduction, the support. And I also want to thank all the participants that were present with us for the questions and just your views. So wishing you the good rest of Thursday, and until the next time, we will be connecting in the beginning of December for another debrief session after the COP29. So we're definitely in the COP season, so tune in less than a month. Follow us on LinkedIn to get all the notifications. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.